The Wolfless Omega was abandoned, bleeding in the snow, until the Alpha King found and saved her. Nerissa watched the ink run as the snow began to fall, but she didn't need to read it to know her fate. The guards were already coming up the path, their torches hissing in the wind. "Don't struggle," the captain muttered, gripping her arm not with malice, but with a soldier's grim duty. "It's a mercy, really. Better the cold takes you than the shame." They left her at the edge of the dead man's mile, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a dagger she couldn't use. "If you're lucky," he said, mounting his horse, "the wolves will find you before the frost does." He was right. But he was wrong about which wolves. The cold was not a thief. It was a sculptor. It chipped away at Nerissa, removing the sensation in her fingertips first, then her toes, then the deep, dull ache in her chest, where her heart beat a frantic, lonely rhythm. She lay curled in the shadow of a jagged pine, the white expanse of the Ironshore territory stretching out like a burial shroud. The wind here didn't just blow, it screamed, tearing through the thin fabric of her dress, seeking the heat of her blood. Nerissa closed her eyes, her lashes heavy with ice. Wolfless. The word had been branded onto her soul since she was a child. In a world governed by the moon and the shift, she was static, human, frail, a genetic dead end in the mighty Ironshore bloodline. Her father, the Alpha, had finally grown tired of the embarrassment. A political liability, he had called her this morning, right before he signed her death warrant. She waited for the fear to consume her, but what came instead was a strange, heavy peace. Hypothermia, she realized dimly. The final mercy. No more sneers, no more sleeping in the ashes of the hearth to steal warmth. Just the white. Thump, thump, thump. The ground vibrated against her cheek. Nerissa's eyes fluttered open. The wind howled, masking the sound. But the earth didn't lie. Something heavy was moving through the deep drifts. Not a deer. Not a lone scaven. The rhythm was coordinated, heavy, militaristic. A pack. She didn't have the strength to hide. She could only watch as the curtain of snow parted. They emerged like nightmares, spun from ink. Wolves. Massive, armored in muscle and thick winter coats, their eyes glowing with predatory intelligence. Leading them was a beast of impossible size, a creature of midnight black, so dark he seemed to drink the light around him. He moved with a terrifying fluidity, his paws tearing up the frozen earth with the force of a landslide. He wasn't slowing down. He was thundering toward her. Nerissa realized with a jolt that she was lying directly in their warpath. She tried to scramble back, but her limbs were wood. She let out a dry, rasping gasp. The sound lost to the gale. The black wolf skidded, snow spraying in a violent arc, stopping inches from her face. Hot breath, smelling of iron, pine and raw power, washed over her. The beast snarled, a sound that vibrated in her very bones. He wasn't looking at her like prey, he was looking at her like an obstruction on his road. Then the shift took him. It was violent and fluid, the audible cracking of bones and reshaping of flesh happening in the blink of an eye. Where the wolf had stood, a man now loomed. He was terrifying. Standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that blocked out the pale sun, he wore the heavy, dark leathers of the northern kings. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, wet with melted snow, clinging to a face carved from granite. But it was his eyes, storm grey, flecked with gold, that pinned her to the ground. Constantine Fairhill, the Alpha King of the North, the butcher of the Greystone Rebellion. The monster mothers used to frighten their pups into obedience. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, devoid of pity. "What is this?" His voice was a low rumble, dangerous and deep. "Ironshore refuse?" One of his lieutenants, a scarred man named Harrison Moorvale, shifted and approached. He was naked, unbothered by the gale, his body steaming in the cold air. It's a female, my king. Smells of nothing. No scent. No wolf. Wolfless, Constantine said, the word tasting like ash. He crouched, his large hand gripping her chin, forcing her head up. His skin was scorching hot against her frozen flesh, a shock that made her gasp. Nerissa tried to pull away, but she was paralyzed. She stared into the eyes of the man who was rumored to kill omegas for sport. "Please," she whispered, the word barely a ghost of sound. Constantine tilted his head. He studied her face, the pale lashes, the blue lips, the defiance that flickered dimly in her eyes despite her weakness. He didn't smell fear on her. He didn't smell anything on her. To his heightened senses, she was a void in the landscape, a blank spot on the map. "Leave her," Harrison suggested, turning back to his clothes bundle tied to a saddlebag. "She's already dead. Waste of resources. The snow will finish it in 10 minutes. Constantine's thumb brushed the hollow of her cheek. It was a rough, possessive gesture. "Since when do we let Ironshore litter on my borders?" He stood up, towering over her. "Harrison, give me your cloak." "My king!" Harrison blinked, confused. "The cloak! Now!" Constantine snatched the heavy fur from his second-in-command and dropped it over Nerissa. It was heavy, smelling of musk, cedar, and aggression, and the warmth of it shocked her system so violently she cried out. "Up!" Constantine commanded. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen blocks of ice. He made a noise of impatience, bent down, and scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed no more than a dry branch. He held her high against his chest, her frozen head lolling against his shoulder. He radiated heat like a furnace, and instinctually she burrowed into him, seeking life. "We ride for the citadel," Constantine roared to his pack. "What do we do with the girl?" Harrison asked, eyeing the bundle in the king's arms with distaste. "She will slow us down." Constantine looked down at her. Nerissa's eyes were rolling back, the darkness finally claiming her. "We keep her," Constantine said, his voice grim. "I want to know why a woman with no scent is still breathing." Pain was the first sign of life. It started in her extremities, a burning, prickling fire as the blood forced its way back into shrunken veins. It felt as though 1,000 needles were being driven into her fingers and toes. Nerissa groaned, thrashing against the softness that engulfed her. "Easy, child. Easy. The pain means you are keeping your fingers." The voice was cool, feminine, and commanding. Hands pressed her shoulders down. Nerissa gasped, her eyes flying open. She was staring at a ceiling of vaulted stone, illuminated by the flicker of a dozen iron chandeliers. She was in a bed, a massive 4-poster monstrosity draped in velvet the color of dried blood. The room smelled of lavender and antiseptic herbs. Where? Her throat felt like she had swallowed glass. "The Fair Hill Citadel," the woman answered. She leaned into the light. She was older, with silver streaks in her dark hair, and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of a scholar. "I am Elowen Greystone, the king's healer." Greystone, the name of the fallen pack, the survivors who served the king. "Am I a prisoner?" Nerissa asked, gripping the sheets. Her instincts screamed at her to run, though her body refused to obey. "That depends on the king's mood," Elowen said dryly. She applied a stinging poultice to Nerissa's frost-bitten fingers. "You are certainly a puzzle. You have no wolf spirit. By all laws of our kind, the cold should have stopped your heart hours before Constantine found you. Your survival is statistically improbable." "Constantine," Nerissa breathed. The memory of the black wolf and the storm-grey eyes returned. "He saved me. He collected you," Elowen corrected gently, wrapping a bandage. "Do not mistake the king's curiosity for kindness. Kindness is a luxury Constantine Fairhill cannot afford. He is a man constantly at war." The heavy oak doors groaned open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew heavier, charged with static electricity, the oppressive weight of an Alpha Prime's aura. It was like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. Constantine strode in. He had bathed and changed into a tunic of black wool and silver embroidery, but the civilization of his clothes did nothing to hide the predator underneath. He moved with a prowling grace, his gaze locking onto Nerissa instantly. Ellawen bowed her head, stepping back. "She is awake, my king, but weak." Constantine ignored her. He walked to the side of the bed, his presence so overwhelming that Nerissa felt the air leave her lungs. He didn't sit. He stood, looking down at her like a general inspecting a captured weapon. "What is your name?" he demanded. "Nerissa," she managed. "Nerissa of Ironshore." "Nerissa of Nowhere," she corrected, a spark of bitterness cutting through her fear. "They threw me away. I have no pack name anymore." Constantina's eyes narrowed. He leaned down, placing a hand on the bedpost near her head, boxing her in. "Ironshore breeds warriors. They cull the weak. Yet you survived the dead man's mile for 6 hours. A wolfless runt." "Maybe I'm hard to kill," she whispered. Constantine laughed, a low, dark sound that lacked humor. "Everything is easy to kill, Nerissa. The question is whether it is worth keeping alive." He reached out, his fingers hovering over her neck. Nerissa flinched, expecting pain. Instead, he touched the pulse point at her throat. His fingers were calloused, his touch clinical, yet burning. He frowned. Silence. "What?" "Your blood," Constantine murmured, leaning closer, his nose flaring slightly as he inhaled. "Usually, even the wolfless have a scent. Fear, sweat, sickness. You smell like snow, like blank parchment, like a ghost." He pulled back, his expression guarded. "It is unsettling. Wolves navigate by scent, Nerissa. You are invisible to half my senses." "I can leave," Nerissa said, though the thought of the snow made her shudder. "You will not," Constantine commanded, the alpha tone slipping into his voice. It slammed into the room, a physical weight meant to force submission. Ellawen flinched in the corner, lowering her gaze. Nerissa blinked. She felt the pressure, the intent of the command, but it didn't force her head down. It didn't buckle her knees. It just washed over her, like water off a duck's back. Constantine went rigid. He stared at her, shock cracking his stoic mask for a fraction of a second. He had used the voice, the command that brought generals to their knees. And she was looking at him, wide-eyed and confused, but entirely upright. "Interesting," he whispered, a dangerous light igniting in his eyes. "What did I do?" Nerissa asked, panic rising. "Did I offend you?" Constantine straightened, his face closing off again. "You just became the most valuable thing in this castle, Nerissa of Nowhere. Rest. You dine with me tonight." "Tonight? I can't walk. My feet." "Then crawl," Constantine said, over his shoulder as he strode toward the door, "or I will carry you again. But be at my table at sundown. I want to see what happens when I throw a ghost into a den of vipers." The dress Ellawen provided was beautiful, a deep emerald silk that clung to Nerissa's starved frame, but it felt like a funeral shroud. It was cut low in the back, exposing the vulnerability of her spine, and the colour marked her as something other than the blacks and greys of the Fairhill court. "He is testing you," Ellawen whispered, as she pinned Nerissa's hair up, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. "The court will be there, the generals, and her." "Her?" Nerissa asked, gripping the arms of the wheelchair Ellawen had procured. "Vincentina Stormcrest," Ellawen said, the name dripping with distaste. "The Alpha of the Western Reach. She is courting the king, in her own aggressive way. She does not like surprises, and she despises weakness." Nerissa looked in the mirror. She looked pale, ghostly, her large hazel eyes too big for her face. She didn't look like a threat to an alpha female. She looked like a snack. When the guards wheeled her into the great hall, the conversation died instantly. The hall was a cavernous space of stone and shadow, warmed by roaring fireplaces large enough to roast a stag whole. Banners of the Black Wolf hung from the rafters. A long table dominated the room, seated with the most terrifying collection of warriors Nerissa had ever seen. They were laughing, drinking, tearing meat with their hands, until they saw her. At the head sat Constantine. He sat on a high-backed chair carved from blackwood, a goblet of wine in his hand. He looked bored, his gaze distant, until it landed on her. To his right sat a woman who could only be Vincentina. She was stunning, a Valkyrie with hair like spun gold and eyes like shards of blue ice. She wore armor to dinner, a polished breastplate over a velvet gown, signaling that she was a warrior first, a woman second. "So this is the Stray," Vincentina drawled, her voice carrying easily across the silence. She didn't look at Nerissa. She looked at Constantine. "You have a strange taste in pets, Constantine." "She is a guest, Vincentina," Constantine said calmly. "Bring her here." The guards wheeled Nerissa to the spot directly to Constantine's left, the place of honor. A ripple of shock went through the room. That seat was usually reserved for allied alphas or high-ranking generals. Vincentina's grip on her goblet tightened, the metal groaning under the pressure. "You insult me, King. You place a cripple, a wolfless defect, at the high table." "I place whom I please where I please," Constantine said, taking a sip of wine. He turned to Nerissa. "Hungry?" Nerissa looked at the spread. Roasted meats, root vegetables, dark breads. The smell was overwhelming. Her stomach roared, betraying her. "Yes. Eat." Nerissa reached for a roll with trembling hands. She could feel the eyes of the court on her. They were wolves, apex predators, and she was a rabbit in their den. Every movement she made felt scrutinized. "She has no scent," Harrison Morvale spoke up from down the table, eyeing her suspiciously. "It's unnatural. Are we sure she isn't a spy? A witch? Ironshore is known for their tricks." "She's Ironshore's daughter," Constantine said, though they were foolish enough to discard her. "Because she is broken," Vincentina spat. She stood up, her movement sudden and violent. "She doesn't belong here. She reeks of weakness. It offends the pack." Constantine didn't move. He didn't even look up from his plate. "Sit down, Vincentina." "No," the female alpha snarled. "I demand to know why you brought this thing into our sanctuary, unless you intend to mate with it." The hall gasped. Forks clattered onto plates. Nerissa froze, the bread turning to ash in her mouth. She looked at Constantine, terrified. Constantine slowly set his goblet down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He turned his head, his eyes glowing with a faint, amber luminescence, the wolf rising to the surface. "Mate with her?" Constantine repeated softly. "Perhaps." Nerissa whipped her head toward him, shock coursing through her. He was lying. He had to be. He was using her to bait Vincentina. But his eyes, they held a heat that wasn't political. Vincentina snarled, her lips pulling back to reveal elongated canines. "She is a null. She cannot bear strong pups. She cannot run the hunt. She is useless." "She survived the storm," Constantine said, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. "And she sits beside me. That makes her under my protection. Strike at her, and you strike at me." Vincentina trembled with rage, her alpha aura flaring out in a wave of suffocating heat. It hit the table, making the weaker wolves flinch and bow their heads. It crashed into Nerissa, and did nothing. Nerissa continued to butter her bread, her hand shaking only slightly from nerves, not from the alpha pressure. She felt the wind of Vincentina's rage, but not the psychic weight of it. Vincentina stared. She pushed harder, projecting a command. Submit. Nerissa looked up, meeting Vincentina's furious gaze. Are you finished? Nerissa asked quietly. I'm trying to eat, and you're shouting. The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison's jaw dropped. Elowen covered a smile with her hand. Constantine threw his head back and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that startled the court more than the defiance. He looked at Nerissa with a dark, appreciative hunger that had nothing to do with food. You see, Vincentina? Constantine grinned, his teeth sharp. Unpredictable. I like unpredictable. Vincentina sat down slowly, her face pale with humiliation and a dawning realization. This girl wasn't just wolfless. She was immune, and in a world where power was dictated by the ability to command, Nerissa was a weapon that could walk through walls. Constantine leaned toward Nerissa, his shoulder brushing hers, a calculated intimacy. Eat up, little ghost, he whispered against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. You're going to need your strength. The game has just begun. The days in Fairhill Citadel were measured not in hours, but in heartbeats of terror. Constantine did not send Nerissa back to the healers. Instead, he moved her into the chambers adjacent to his own, a suite of rooms filled with books, maps, and the lingering, omnipresent scent of cedar and rain that was his signature. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. He was testing her. Every day brought a new trial. On the fourth morning, he dragged her to the training rinks, a circle of packed earth, surrounded by high stone walls, where the elite guard, the Varangian, honed their violence. The air smelled of sweat and blood. Nerissa stood shivering in the biting wind, wrapped in a fur cloak that was far too large for her. Harrison Moorvale was there, along with a dozen other shifters, stripped to the waist, their bodies steaming in the cold. Again, Constantine ordered. He stood behind Nerissa, his hands resting heavily on her shoulders. He wasn't holding her up. He was anchoring her. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes flashing a neon amber. He opened his mouth and unleashed a roar that was less sound and more concussive force. It was the Alpha Roar, a sonic weapon meant to paralyze prey and force submission in lesser wolves. Around the ring, seasoned warriors flinched. A young serving boy near the gate dropped a pitcher of water, falling to his knees, his neck bared in instinctual surrender. Nerissa just blinked. The wind of the shout blew her hair back, but her heart rate didn't spike. She didn't feel the crushing urge to kneel. She just felt annoyed. Nothing, Harrison panted, wiping sweat from his brow. It's like shouting at a stone, my king. She's empty. Constantine's grip on her shoulders tightened. Not empty. Impervious. He spun her around, his movement so fast she gasped. He was looming over her, his face inches from hers, the intensity of his gaze burning worse than the frost. Do you know what you are, Nerissa? He whispered. I am wolfless. She recited the curse she had known since birth. I am a mistake. No, Constantine corrected, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was confusingly tender for such a violent man. You are a null, a ghost in the machine. The wolves rely on scent, on the psychic weight of dominance. But you simply do not exist to them until you are seen. He stepped back, gesturing to the ring. Turn around. In the center of the ring, a cage was being wheeled out. Inside, a feral wolf, a rogue captured from the borderlands, threw itself against the iron bars, foam dripping from its jaws. It was insane with hunger and rage. Constantine, Nerissa whispered, real fear finally spiking in her chest. What are you doing? Testing the theory, he said coldly. Walk to the center of the ring. It will kill me. It might, he agreed. But if I am right, it won't even know you are there. He shoved her forward, not hard, but with enough force to send her stumbling into the circle. The gate slammed shut behind her. Nerissa stood alone on the packed earth. The cage door creaked open. The rogue wolf burst out, a blur of grey fur and snapping teeth. It skidded to a halt, sniffing the air frantically, eyes darting around the perimeter. It growled at Harrison. It snapped at the guards on the wall. It looked right through Nerissa. She stood 20 feet away, frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The beast was hunting, its nose twitching, searching for the scent of prey. But Nerissa had no scent. To the wolf, she was just part of the background, a tree, a rock, a patch of snow. She took a trembling step backward. Her boot crunched on gravel. The wolf's ears swiveled. It turned its head, yellow eyes narrowing. It had heard her, but it couldn't smell her, and the cognitive dissonance seemed to confuse it. It snarled, stepping closer, uncertain. "Don't run!" Constantine's voice came from the wall, calm and steady. "If you run, you trigger the chase instinct. Stand your ground." The wolf lunged, not a kill strike, but a testing snap. Nerissa didn't think. She couldn't outrun a wolf. She couldn't outfight it. So she did the only thing she had ever learned to do in the house of her father. She became small. She stayed utterly still, holding her breath, closing her eyes, and willing herself to disappear. The wolf's hot breath washed over her face. She felt its whiskers brush her cheek. It sniffed her neck, a wet, invasive snuffling. Then it sneezed. It huffed in irritation, turned around, and trotted away to mark the corner of the arena. Nerissa let out a sob of relief, her knees buckling. Before she hit the ground, Constantine was there. He had vaulted the wall, landing silently. He caught her, pulling her against his hard chest. "You see?" he murmured into her hair, his voice vibrating with a dark triumph. "You aren't prey, Nerissa. You're the ultimate predator, the one they never see coming." He lifted her chin, forcing her to look at him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her trembling, but his proximity lit a different kind of fire in her blood. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because," Constantine said, his eyes darkening to the color of a bruised sky. "I have many enemies, little ghost, and you are the only knife they won't be able to smell." The respite lasted 2 weeks. In that time, Nerissa's frostbite healed, leaving only faint silver scars on her fingertips. Her ribs filled out, the hollows of her cheeks softening thanks to Elowin's rich stews, and the incessant feasts Constantine insisted she attend. She was becoming a fixture at court, the silent lady, they called her, the Alpha King's shadow. But the past was not done with her. It arrived on a Tuesday, under a banner of truce that fooled no one. A delegation from Iron Shore. Nerissa was in the library, reading a history of the first shift, when the horns blew. She went to the window and froze. Riding through the gates, clad in white furs and arrogance, was a figure she knew better than her own reflection. Ariel Ironshaw, her half-sister. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She turned to flee, to hide in the labyrinth of the citadel, but the door opened. "The king requests your presence in the throne room," a guard said. He looked at her with pity. Everyone knew where she had come from. Nerissa smoothed the skirts of her midnight blue gown, a gift from Constantine, and lifted her chin. She was not the girl in the snow anymore. She was the ghost who walked through wolves. The throne room was tense. The Fairhill wolves lined the walls, hands on hilts, while the small Ironshaw delegation stood in the center. Ariel looked bored, checking her nails, until Nerissa walked in. For a moment, Ariel's mask slipped. Shock, pure and unadulterated, widened her eyes. "You," Ariel breathed. "You're supposed to be dead." Nerissa walked past her, ignoring the urge to flinch, and took her place at the foot of Constantine's dais. He sat sprawled on his throne, looking dangerous and bored, but his eyes tracked Nerissa's every movement. Supposed to be, Constantine drawled, is a concept for lesser beings, Ariel. Your sister proved resilient. She is not my sister, Ariel spat, regaining her composure. She is a genetic failure, a drain on resources. And yet, Constantine said, leaning forward, you rode 3 days through a blizzard to claim her. Ariel's smile was thin and sharp. My father, Alpha Ironshaw, has had a change of heart. He worries for Nerissa's soul. He wishes her returned to the family crypts, to be buried with dignity. Buried? Nerissa spoke up, her voice ringing clear in the hall. You mean you want to finish what the cold failed to do? Ariel turned on her, her eyes flashing gold. You shut your mouth, you defective little... Careful, Constantine's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. He didn't shout, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You are speaking to a member of my household. She is Ironshaw property, Ariel shrieked, losing her cool. She belongs to us. You cannot keep her, Fairhill. It's an act of war. Constantine stood up. He descended the stairs slowly, step by step, until he towered over Oriel. She shrank back, her wolf instincts screaming at the proximity of an Alpha Prime. War? Constantine chuckled softly. Ariel, I destroyed the Greystone Rebellion before breakfast on a Tuesday. Do not threaten me with your father's whelping ground. He moved to stand beside Nerissa, placing a heavy hand on the small of her back. It was possessive, territorial, a declaration. She is not property, Constantine said, his voice low and intimate, directed only at Ariel. She is mine, and if your father wants her back, tell him to come and take her. I will pave the road to my castle with his teeth. Ariel paled. She looked from Constantine to Nerissa, seeing the hand on her back, the way the king shielded her body with his own. You're mating her? Ariel whispered, revulsion and disbelief warring in her tone. You're mating a null. Get out, Constantine said softly. Ariel scrambled back, signaling her guards. But before she fled, she cast one last look at Nerissa, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This isn't over, ghost, she hissed. The moon judges all. When the doors slammed shut, the adrenaline left Nerissa's legs. She swayed, and Constantine caught her instantly, swinging her up into his arms. Why? She whispered, clinging to his tunic. Why did you do that? You just started a war. Constantine looked down at her, his expression fierce. Let them come. It's been a boring winter. He carried her out of the hall, ignoring the whispers of his court. But Nerissa saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't just boredom. It was rage. He was angry for her, and that terrified her more than the Ironshaw army ever could. The tension in the castle after Ariel's departure was suffocating. Vincentina Stormcrest was pacing the corridors like a caged tigress, furious that Constantine had risked political stability for the stray. To diffuse the mood, or perhaps to provoke it, Constantine announced a solstice hunt. It was a tradition, a night run through the moonlit forest to cull the stag population before the deep freeze. Nerissa was not meant to go. She was human, slow, fragile. But Constantine insisted. You will ride with me, he said, strapping a dagger to her thigh himself. I want you close. I'll slow you down, she argued. Then I will move slower. They rode out at dusk, the snow glowing blue under the rising moon. The forest was alive with the sounds of the pack, howls, yips, the thrum of paws on frozen earth. Nerissa rode in front of Constantine on his massive war-horse, enclosed in the circle of his arms. It was intoxicating, the heat of him, the scent of pine and power, the way his chest rumbled against her back when he gave orders. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a world where she wasn't a defect, but a queen. But fantasies in the north were dangerous. They were deep in the woods, separated from the main pack, when the silence fell. It wasn't the natural silence of the forest. It was the heavy, artificial silence of an ambush. Constantine reined the horse in, his body going rigid. "Hush! What is it?" "We are not alone." An arrow hissed through the air, striking the tree next to Nerissa's head with a dull thwack. Constantine roared, flinging a protective barrier of air around them, an alpha ability. But a second arrow struck the horse's flank. The beast reared, screaming, and threw them into the snow. Nerissa hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. She scrambled up, dagger in hand, searching the darkness. 3 figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't Ironshaw wolves. They were clad in black, their faces masked. Mercenaries. Constantine was on his feet instantly, shifting. The black wolf erupted from his skin, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. He tore into the first attacker, ripping his throat out in a spray of hot crimson. But the other 2 were smart. They had silver-tipped spears. One lunged for the wolf, driving the spear into Constantine's shoulder. The wolf howled, a sound of pain that shattered Nerissa's heart. He snapped the spear shaft with his jaws, but the silver was burning him, weakening him. The third assassin turned toward Nerissa. He raised a crossbow, but he hesitated. He was scanning the tree line, looking for the alpha's mate, expecting a wolf. He was looking for a scent, a growl, a shift of magic. He didn't see the small, pale girl standing in the shadow of the oak tree. He looked right past her, a ghost in the machine. Nerissa didn't think. She didn't breathe. She just moved. She stepped out of the shadow, closing the distance in 3 silent strides. The assassin was still squinting into the darkness when she drove her dagger into the gap between his neck and shoulder armor. He gurgled, dropping the crossbow, grabbing at his neck. Nerissa ripped the blade free, hot blood spraying her face. She felt sick, but she didn't stop. The second assassin, the one engaging Constantine, heard the body fall. He turned, distracted for a fraction of a second. That was all Constantine needed. The black wolf lunged, jaws closing around the man's head. There was a sickening crunch, and then silence. Constantine stood panting, blood, both his and theirs, staining the snow. He didn't shift back immediately. He limped toward Nerissa, the silver tip still embedded in his shoulder. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She was covered in blood, shaking violently, clutching a dagger. She had just killed a man. The wolf whined. He pressed his massive head against her chest, smearing blood on her white tunic. It was a gesture of submission, of gratitude. Nerissa dropped the knife and buried her hands in his fur, sobbing, "You're hurt." The shift took him slowly, painfully. Constantine collapsed into the snow, naked and bleeding, the spearhead jutting from his deltoid. "Nerissa," he rasped, his hand gripping her ankle. "Pull it out." "I can't," she wept. "It will kill you. The silver is poison," he gritted out. "Do it." She straddled him, her hands slippery with blood. She gripped the broken shaft. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Do it!" She pulled. Constantine screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed through the trees. The metal slid free, followed by a rush of dark blood. He slumped back, his eyes rolling shut, his breathing shallow. Nerissa pressed her hands over the wound, desperate to staunch the flow. "Stay with me. Please, Constantine, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open. They were hazy, the gold flecks dim. He reached up, his bloody hand cupping her cheek, smearing red across her pale skin. "You saved me," he whispered, wonder softening the pain in his voice. "My little ghost, you saved me." "Help is coming," she promised, though the woods were silent. "Just hold on." "Nerissa," he murmured, his thumb brushing her lip. "If I die, you won't die." "If I die," he insisted, his voice fading. "Know this. You were never wolfless. You have the heart of a queen." His hand fell away. "Constantine!" she screamed, her voice cracking the frozen air. But the King of the North did not answer. The snow began to fall again, covering the blood, covering to the bodies, threatening to bury them both in the white grave she had escaped once before. The citadel, usually a fortress of noise and iron, had become a tomb. The silence was heavy, pressing against the eardrums, broken only by the crackle of the hearth in the royal chambers. Constantine lay on a bed of furs, his body a landscape of ruin. The silver-tipped spear had done more than pierce flesh. It had introduced a rot that was spreading. Black veins, like ink spilled on parchment, spider-webbed from his shoulder across the expanse of his chest, pulsing with a sickly rhythm that was out of sync with his heart. "He isn't turning," Harrison Morvale growled, his voice tight with suppressed panic. He paced the length of the room, his boots heavy on the stone, turning at the window like a caged tiger. "The healing factor is stalled. It's been 12 hours. He should be healing." Elowen Greystone stood over the king, her hands glowing with faint green restorative magic. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she poured her energy into the wound, but the magic sputtered and died against his skin, repelled by the dark alchemy of the poison. "The silver was laced with wolfsbane and necrotic ash," Elowen said, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "It's suppressing his wolf spirit. It has locked the beast in a cage of pain. Without the wolf to drive the metabolism, the man is just a man. And a dying one." Nerissa sat by the bed, her hand gripping Constantine's burning fingers. She hadn't slept. She was still wearing her tunic from the hunt, the fabric stiff with dried blood, his and the assassin's. She refused to leave. She refused to let go. "He needs an anchor," Elowen said softly, her eyes flicking to Nerissa. "Shifters heal through connection, through the pack bond. Usually, the Alpha draws strength from his lieutenants, from the collective will of the pack. But his wolf is too weak to reach out to us. He is drifting in the dark. He reached out to me," Nerissa whispered, her voice rough. "In the woods, when he was bleeding out. He called me a queen." Harrison stopped pacing. He looked at the small, fragile woman holding the hand of the most dangerous predator in the north. He had doubted her. He had mocked her scentlessness. But he had seen the dead assassin in the snow. He had seen her pull the spear when no one else could. "Then call him back," Harrison commanded, his voice cracking with desperate authority. "If you are his, make him stay. Drag him back from the edge if you have to." Nerissa looked at Constantine's face. It was grey, the strong jaw slack, the lips that had teased her only hours ago, now parted in shallow breaths. She felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, cut through her grief. "Leave us," Nerissa said. Harrison hesitated. "Nerissa," I said, "leave us." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the dying king. Nerissa leaned down. She pressed her forehead against Constantine's fever-hot temple. She didn't have a wolf. She didn't have magic. She didn't have a telepathic bond. She had nothing but the stubborn, ragged refusal to be abandoned again. "You don't get to leave," she whispered into the silence, her breath mingling with the heat radiating from him. "You don't get to pick me up out of the snow. Show me a world where I matter, and then leave me alone in it. Do you hear me, Constantine Fairhill?" She moved her hand to his chest, right over the silent heart of the corruption. "That is cruel, and you are arrogant and violent and demanding, but you are not cruel." She closed her eyes, visualizing the man inside the monster. Not the king, but the person who had covered her with a cloak, the man who had laughed when she defied an alpha. "Come back," she demanded, her voice shaking. "I am not strong enough to do this without you. I am just a ghost, remember? I need my anchor. Come back, or I will come find you in the dark, and I will be very, very angry." She kissed his cheek, a soft brush of lips against rough skin, and then lingered near his ear. "Constantine, please." A low rumble started in his chest. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't the sound of a beast preparing to strike. It was deeper, more primal. It was a purr, a vibration of pure, possessive contentment that rattled through his ribs and into her palm. The black veins on his chest halted their advance. Slowly, agonizingly, the color began to shift. The angry red of the wound started to knit together, steam rising from the flesh as the alpha's metabolism roared back to life, fueled by the connection she had forged. Constantine's eyes opened. The gold in them was molten, glowing with a terrifying intensity that lit up the dim room. The grey storm was gone. Only the wolf remained. He didn't look around the room. He didn't look for a weapon. He looked at Nerissa. "You are loud," he rasped, his voice wrecked like gravel in a grinder, but undeniably alive. "Even when you whisper, you echo in my head." Nerissa choked on a sob, the relief hitting her so hard she nearly collapsed. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, smelling the scent of pine and rain returning to his skin, overpowering the sickness. His arms came up, weak, shaking, but steady enough to wrap around her. He pulled her down onto the furs with him, burying his nose in her hair. "I found the traitor," Constantine murmured against her scalp, his voice gaining strength with every heartbeat. "In the delirium, the scent came back to me. The assassins, they didn't smell of the wilds. They smelled of lavender and steel." Nerissa froze. "Lavender?" "Vincentina," Constantine growled, the name vibrating against her chest. "She didn't want a mate. She wanted a crown, and she knew I would never give it to her." He tried to sit up, wincing, his eyes hardening into flint. "Lock down the castle, Nerissa. Tell Harrison to seal the gates. The hunt isn't over." The betrayal was not a simple assassination attempt. It was a decapitation strike followed by a coup. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in hues of violent orange, the war horns of the Western Reach blew from the valley floor. Vincentina Stormcrest had not come alone. She had brought her army, 300 heavy cavalry wolves, and she had opened the gates from the inside before Harrison could trigger the lockdown. Chaos erupted in the courtyard. The clash of steel, the roar of shifting bodies, and the screams of the dying shattered the evening peace. Constantine was not fully healed. His left arm was stiff, his movement slightly lagging, but he refused to hide. He was armor-clad in black steel, a demon of war, leading the charge at the main keep. Harrison was at his flank, a blur of grey fur and violence, but the enemy had numbers, and they had position. "Archers!" Harrison roared, diving behind a stone pillar as arrows rained down from the upper battlements. Nerissa watched from the balcony of the royal chambers, her hands gripping the stone railing until her knuckles turned white. She saw the stalemate. The Western wolves were holding the gate, while archers on the high tower, Vincentina's personal guard, were pinning the Fairhill wolves down in the killing field of the courtyard. She saw Constantine fighting 3 wolves at once. He was magnificent, a whirlwind of skill, but he was favoring his shoulder. Every parry cost him energy he didn't have. If the archers weren't stopped, Constantine would fall, and this time there would be no coming back. Nerissa looked at the heavy oak door of the safe room where Elowen had told her to hide. Then she looked at the dagger on her belt, the simple iron blade Constantine had given her. "You are the only knife they won't be able to smell." Nerissa didn't run to the safe room. She ran to the servants' stairs. She moved through the chaos like a phantom. The corridors were filled with the sounds of skirmishes. But she didn't engage. She walked past fighting wolves who were too focused on the scent of blood, adrenaline, and pheromones to notice a scentless girl in a dark cloak pressing herself against the tapestries. She was a void, a gap in their perception. She reached the tower door, It was guarded by a massive brute from Vincentina's pack, a shifter in human form, holding a heavy mace. He was scanning the corridor, sniffing the air, his ears twitching. Nerissa stopped breathing. She waited until a crash from the floor below drew his attention for a split second. She walked right up to him. He didn't turn until she was 3 feet away, and by then, the cognitive dissonance of seeing something he couldn't smell delayed his reaction. He blinked, confused. Nerissa didn't hesitate. She ducked under his swing, slipped past his bulk, and entered the stairwell before his brain could fully register her presence as a threat. She climbed, her lungs burned, her legs shook, but the image of Constantine fighting in the snow drove her upward. She burst onto the battlements. The wind was howling here, masking the sound of her arrival. There were 6 archers, firing rhythmically into the courtyard. Leading them was Vincentina herself. She held a heavy weirwood longbow, the string drawn taut. She wasn't aiming at the soldiers. She was aiming at Constantine's exposed back as he battled a Western lieutenant. "Goodbye, lover," Vincentina purred, her eyes alight with a manic triumph. She never released the string. Nerissa didn't scream a battle cry. She didn't waste breath on speeches. She crossed the stone roof in silence, a shadow detaching itself from the night. She slammed her body weight into Vincentina's side just as the Alpha released the arrow. The bow misfired. The arrow skittered harmlessly off the stone parapet, sparking into the dark. Vincentina stumbled, spinning around with a snarl, reaching for her sword. When she saw Nerissa standing there, panting, wind-whipped and small, her eyes widened in genuine, baffled confusion. "How?" Vincentina gasped, sniffing the air frantically. "I didn't smell you. You weren't there." "I know," Nerissa said, her voice steady, despite the terror hammering in her chest. She held her dagger out, the metal gleaming cold in the moonlight. "You foolish, broken little thing," Vincentina laughed, the sound sharp and incredulous. She drew a short sword, the blade humming with energy. "You think you can fight an Alpha? I will snap you like a twig." "No," Nerissa said, taking a calculated step back toward the icy edge of the roof. "I can't fight you." Vincentina lunged, a blur of speed and lethal intent. Nerissa didn't try to block. She didn't try to dodge. She simply dropped. She threw herself flat to the icy stones. Vincentina's momentum was committed. She expected resistance. She expected a body to strike, to cut through. Instead, her blade sliced through empty air. Her boots hit the slick patch of ice Nerissa had spotted earlier. She flailed, trying to catch her balance, arms windmilling. But physics was the one law an Alpha could not command. With a shriek of pure, undiluted rage, the Alpha of the West toppled over the low parapet. The scream was long, piercing the din of the battle, before it was cut short by a sickening, final thud in the courtyard below. Silence rippled outward from the center of the keep. It spread like a shockwave. The Western wolves stopped fighting, sensing the sudden, violent snuffing of their Alpha's life force. The bond snapped. Nerissa stood up on the battlements, shivering violently. She looked down. Constantine was looking up. He stood over Vincentina's broken body, his chest heaving, his sword lowered. He looked up at the tower, at the small silhouette framed against the massive white moon. He didn't speak. He threw his head back and howled. It wasn't a mournful sound. It was a sound of victory, of pride, of claiming. It was a song that told the world, "Look at what is mine." And one by one, the Fairhill wolves joined him, their voices rising in a chorus that shook the mountains, howling for the silent lady who had toppled a giant. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a coronation carved from the bones of victory. The Ironshore delegation, led by Ariel, had been waiting at the border, vultures circling, ready to scavenge the remains of the Fairhill pack once Vincentina had done the dirty work. Instead, they were met by a united front. When the news reached them that Vincentina was dead, killed not by the king, but by the Wolfless runt. Ariel turned her horse around and fled back to the safety of her father's walls. The psychological blow was greater than any military defeat. The ghost had teeth. In the great hall of Fairhill, the mood was solemn but electric. The tables had been cleared, the wounded tended to. Nerissa stood before the dais. She had tried to retreat to the shadows, to the safety of anonymity, but Constantine wouldn't allow it. "Come here," he commanded, sitting on the blackwood throne. He looked tired, his bandage stark white against his black tunic, but his power was undimmed. Nerissa approached. She was bruised, exhausted, her hair wind-tangled. She felt small in the vast hall. Constantine stood. The movement silenced the room. He descended the stairs, step by heavy step, until he stood directly in front of her. He didn't care about the blood on his boots or the hundreds of eyes watching them. "They call you Wolfless," Constantine said, his voice carrying to the rafters, bouncing off the stone shields of his ancestors. "They called you broken, weak, a mistake of nature." He reached out and took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "But a wolf relies on the pack," he continued softly, intimate despite the audience. "A wolf relies on instinct, on muscle, on the moon. You rely only on yourself. You walked through fire and ice with no armor but your own will. You faced an alpha on a rooftop with nothing but a knife and your courage." He turned to the court. "Harrison." The beta stepped forward, carrying a velvet cushion. On it sat a circlet of dark iron and frost glass, the crown of the winter consort. It had not been worn in 100 years. "No," Nerissa whispered, panic fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. "Constantine, I can't. I'm not one of you. I can't shift. I can't lead a hunt." "Exactly," Constantine said, a small, fierce smile curving his lips. He took the crown. "We have enough claws in this room. We have enough rage. You are something better. You are the balance. You are the silence that quiets the storm." He placed the crown on her head. It was heavy, cold, and felt strangely right, as if the iron recognized the steel in her spine. "I, Constantine Fairhill, King of the North, claim you," he vowed, his eyes burning into hers, searing the promise into her soul. "Not as a pet, not as a ward, but as my queen, my equal, my ghost." He kissed her then, a searing, possessive kiss that claimed her more thoroughly than any mark or crown ever could. It was a kiss of gratitude, of passion, and of a deep, abiding relief. The court erupted. There were no sneers this time, no whispers of "runt." The wolves slammed their fists on the tables, stomping their feet in a rhythm that shook the floor. They threw their heads back and howled, a deafening salute. They didn't bow to her because of her bloodline. They bowed because she had bled for them. They bowed because she was the only thing in the world that scared the monsters away. Nerissa looked out at the sea of faces, and then up at the man who had found her dying in the snow. The cold was gone. For the first time in her life, she was warm. The legends of the North say that the strongest wolves are those with the loudest roar, the sharpest teeth, the darkest fur. But the history books of Fairhill tell a different story. They tell of the Winter King and his silent queen. Nerissa never shifted. She never grew claws or ran on 4 paws under the full moon. But she redefined power in a land of monsters. She taught a kingdom of predators that while the wolf may rule the wild, it is the human heart, resilient, clever, and fiercely loving, that rules the wolf. She was the girl who was thrown away to die, yet she became the anchor that held the North together. In the end, she wasn't wolfless. She simply carried the heart of the Alpha King in her hands, and that was a magic more powerful than any shift. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and a love that defies the odds, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the Winter Court. Let me know in the comments. In a world of wolves, would you rather have the strength of a beast or the stealth of a ghost?